welcoming everyone to the Syria Justice and Accountability Center's panel, The Risks of Return, the Myth of a Safe Syria. Thank you for dedicating a portion of your day to this very important discussion that we look forward to having with you over the next hour and a half. My name is Tina Khirsan, and I am the Policy Officer for the Syria Justice and Accountability Center, otherwise known as SJAC. I will be your moderator for the duration of the event. I want to provide a bit of background as to the context in which we are having this conversation and the pressing need that exists for this panel today. Over the last few years, and especially the last few months, the inaccurate idea that Syria is safe has taken hold in the European Union, resulting in a growing number of states advocating for the return of Syrian refugees to Syria. Within the EU, we have seen increasingly restrictive measures targeted towards refugees, with states turning to externalization as a solution, and with immigration authorities increasingly denying Syrians the right to seek asylum. The current displacement of Syrian refugees and Lebanese nationals from Lebanon to Syria as a result of Israeli bombardment has also reignited the conversation, with some policymakers incorrectly making strides to claim that this wave of recent displacement demonstrates that Syria is safe. These growing ideas in the EU are coupled with a lack of accurate information on the ongoing rights violations occurring in Syria currently, and the rights violations that refugees are subjected to upon return. In addition, we have seen de facto authorities within Syria and across different regions trying to benefit politically, claiming that they are ready to receive refugees, even as civil society continues to assert that Syria is not safe. As such, SJAC has decided to host this panel featuring remarks from the Special Envoy for Syria from France, a Syrian lawyer, activist, and documenter on the ground, Human Rights Watch, and Equal Rights Beyond Borders. We hope that this conversation serves as a means for attendees to obtain accurate information regarding the current situation in Syria, the rights violations refugees are subjected to upon return, and the desperate need to counter increasingly restrictive asylum policy in the EU. Before I pass the floor to the esteemed Mr. Jean-Francois Guillaume, I would like to quickly go over some more logistics. If you have not found the interpretation button at this time, I would like to remind you it is on the bottom right-hand side where you can click on the globe. The event will also be roughly an hour and a half with time for questions and answers at the end of the event. Please feel free to send in your questions as they come up. Lastly, we will have a recording of the event available online after the event is over. With that said, I will hand the proverbial microphone over to our first esteemed guest, Special Envoy Jean-Francois Guillaume for Syria from France for his opening remarks. Mr. Jean-Francois Guillaume is France's Special Envoy for Syria since September 2024. Between 2021 and 2024, Mr. Guillaume was chargé d'affaires in Beirut. Before, from 2018 to 2021, he was Chief of Mission for Stabilization at the Crisis Center of the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, and Chief of Center for Humanitarian and Stabilization Operations. Prior to that, he was in Iraq from 2015 to 2018 as chargé d'affaires of the French Embassy in Baghdad. Between 2012 and 2015, Mr. Guillaume was diplomatic counselor of the Supreme Commander of the Atlantic Alliance for Transformation in Norfolk. Mr. Guillaume also held positions such as political counsel in Riyadh from 2008 to 2012, First Secretary in Kinshasa between 2000 and 2003, Chief of the Press Service in Algiers between 1997 and 1999. He has a diploma from the French Institute of Political Sciences and was awarded the National Order of Merit and the Foreign Affairs Medal of Honor. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Guillaume. The floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this fascinating panel, and thank you for your organization to deal with both the logistics, but also to have this interesting people speaking about this terrible crisis from Syria. I'm new in the job. I'm only there since 2 months, but I can share with you the view we have from the last year, let's say, an incoming crisis from the last 2 months on the topic you were mentioning, which is the refugee issue. First of all, I would like to just express on the political process. It is stalled in the context, sadly, of the regional crisis unfolding. This current regional crisis is weakening the Syrian regime and affecting Syria as a whole. Mass population displacement, regional escalation, signals sent by Israel to the Damascus regime, as far as we understand from the press, intensification of the Israeli bombing on the Syrian territory against position of the Hezbollah or pro-Iranian militia, but also of the regime. All of this is also a factor of instability on the existing instability in Syria. The Syrian regime on its side is more and more a narco-state caught in an uncompromising logic, keeps being a source of instability for the whole area through drug trafficking, Captagon, through the handling of the refugee issue, through the warrings of Iranian proxy on its ground, and also by extorting a massive amount of money of an already very poor population through jail, conscription issue, and so on. And in any way never show any disposal to work on the political process, which is included in the resolution 2254. In the meantime, the war between Israel, Iran, Palestinian, and Lebanon has a dramatic impact on the humanitarian and security situation of the Syrian population, both abroad and inside Syria. It's causing a massive population displacement, as you know. More than 440,000 people fled the war in Lebanon, part Syrian, part Lebanese. And the crossing, in our view, of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon towards Syria cannot, in any case, be assimilated to voluntary return. They are just fleeing a war. No sustainable return to stability in Syria could happen without a political solution answering the aspiration of all Syrians. As we always mention, we are ready under the condition of a tangible and verifiable progress of the political process to start lifting sanctions, to consider fund reconstruction, and as many of the EU member states. France continues to support in this regard the effort of the UN Special Envoy Geir Pedersen, and of course the implementation of the resolution 2254. We didn't change on this line. And this only could set the basis of a lasting peace to resolve the Syrian crisis. We are also, and I pledge to the organization we are working with today, taking part in the fight against impunity in order to hold accountable crime perpetrators in Syria since the beginning of the war. In this context, one of the topics of the moment is a review of the European Union strategy on Syria. Why did it happen? During the summer 2024, some member states asked in a political tribune in the press to have a review on this strategy, arguing the fact that the strategy came back from 2017, and since then the situation has deeply changed on the ground with 4 de facto authorities: northeastern Syria, northwest Syria, the interim government for Syria, and the regime area. In this regard, there is no, in the view of France, in any case, to review the political principle this European Union strategy. We never question the principle, the values of the European Union in this regard, but we have to review, in the light of the existing crisis and also the refugee crisis, the way we utilize our tools inside to implement this EU strategy. In this matter, there is question on early recovery, as you know, how we handling it, where, as you know, we want to do it on the wall of Syria. How do you work on the regime issue, knowing the corruption, the fact that there is massive disruption of the money we could send by the regime or by organizations sponsored by the regime. We have to think also about how to handle the European sanction. Initially, they have been created to be lifted one day if there is a political process which fits with the pertinent, relevant UN resolution. We have to also take into consideration what the NGO are telling us, working in all of Syria, about the issue of the over-compliance of the banking system abroad, which is a real issue, even for us as an institution when we want to work in stabilization or humanitarian issue in Syria as a French state. There is the issue of Captagon, which didn't exist really in 2017, which is now taking regional aspects, which is threatening many partners and allies in the area. It has to be tackled, and the sanction also are part of this process, but not only. We need more coordination and more effective coordination, more naming and shaming also on the one who are handling this Captagon issue, knowing the fact also that the spreading of Captagon is now an issue of consuming of Syrian, but also in neighboring countries. It's not only a production, but it's also a consuming area. And of course, to end with, how we handling the issue of the Syrian refugee, mainly because there is also this actual crisis about the refugee with the arrival of those 440,000 as the last figure, but it will continue to grow, sadly, from Lebanon to Syria. In this matter, our analysis of the issue of the Syrian refugee crisis. A debate does exist inside Europe, but not only. As you know, all the neighbors of deeply, it's a deep burden for them. I'm just coming back from Lebanon, and I can tell you it's an existential issue for the Lebanese authorities. It's an issue in Jordan, it's an issue for Turkey, and it is a long-lasting. As you know, as far as I remember, EU has spent since the beginning of 2011, the beginning of the Syrian revolution, nearly 30 billion euro on the Syrian crisis. We are the first contributor, and we certainly continue to be hit, I hope. Still, there is other crises, Ukraine, Sudan, still Haiti, and pre-existing crises which are continuing, new crises arriving. So we could notice in the Brussels 8 pledging conference that there is a fatigue from the donors, sadly. This is a reality, and we have to deal with it. We are continuing asking that the condition for secure, dignified, and voluntary returning has to be met. And it is not the case. It's not for the 400,000 people who have left Lebanon. They didn't did that on their will. They were fleeing a situation of war. So for us, it's not a voluntary return. And the aspect of secure and dignified return and a lasting return, which means also that there has to be a certain number of guarantees that I will list, are not there. Many NGOs are mentioning cases of already arrest and disappearance of returnees, not exactly returnees, people who fled Lebanon, that are highlighting that Syria is not a safe country, that whatever Bashar al-Assad can tell to the different relevant UN agency is meeting, his issue is not sure to fulfill the promises he's doing because of the way the regime area has evolved to a narco state, where more and more mobsters, mafia, and all the different relevant non-etatic groups are dealing with the daily life of Syrian, do not allow Dawla, the state, to be sure that he can implement whatever promises, which have not been met yet, and by the way, could be implemented on the ground on the way that could be verified by, in particular, UNHCR or all the relevant UN agencies. We think that all this concept about safe area in Syria doesn't exist. As you know, there has been a ruling, or maybe you don't know, so I announce you, by the European Court of Justice from the 4th of October 2024, indicates that the designation of a safe country of origin should extend to the whole territory of the country. And as you know, for Syria, you cannot status on this aspect of safe countries. There is no safe zone in Syria, sadly. This security and political barrier are the first reason for which Syrian refugees do not wish to come back to Syria. As we say in French, they vote with their feet. The study of the UNHCR 2024 about the intention of return of Syrian refugees mentioned less than 2% of Syrian refugees are planning to come back to Syria in the current situation. So you have to cross those two issues, the burden that cannot bear anymore many Arabic countries around Syria, but also Turkey, with this lack of willingness of those Syrian refugees. So the responsibility to create conditions for a secure, dignified, and voluntary return of refugees come back in majority to the Syrian regime, that's first, but also to all the de facto actors in Syria. We are supporting in this perspective the effort of Filippo Grandi and the UNHCR in its dialogue with the regime to push it to set up and implement those guarantees. I mentioned also we like that the relevant UN agency deal with the whole of Syria, which means with all de facto actors existing in the area. As you know, many refugees from the existing fleeing from Lebanon are heading to the north, not in the regime area. So these guarantees, you know them, but I just repeat them because it's the French position. It means security guarantees, absence of discrimination, arbitrary detention, physical threats, a general amnesty on this conscription issue, the lifting of the compulsory conscription for people coming back, which is an economy of extortion. As you know, to get released from those areas, you need sometimes to pay $10,000 for a crime you didn't make. The land and property right restitution. Why will you come back if you know that you don't have any way to live anymore in those areas because it has been sold by the regime? The administrative regulation of returnees, the respect of the destination of choice, which is very important nowadays. As you mentioned, a lot of people are heading to a different place because they don't own their original place, and the residence of the returnees. Very important for us in the existing crisis, and with full support of the UNHCR endeavor and efforts to negotiate with the regime. The regime must also guarantee an unimpeded access to the whole of Syrian territory, which means also with the de facto authorities, and enable the UNHCR to set up a solid and systematic monitoring mechanism of returnees, which, as far as I understand, is not the case yet, and there is no the freedom of circulating in Syria for the team of the UNHCR, as far as I understand. Of course, in case of a credible and verifiable gesture from the regime in this regard, and implementation in this condition, and launching the political process that is scheduled by the relevant resolution, France, and I think many other states, will be ready to increase its funding of early recovery projects in the regime area, but in also the rest of Syria, and in order to support the lasting return of Syrian refugees. It means that, of course, there is a reality, a situation. So I don't know what part has been skipped off, but in the context, France will continue to support hosting countries welcoming millions of Syrian refugees by economic support, hosting in France of Syrian refugees, present of our support and NGO in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. We will mobilize in the framework of the European reflection to improve the tools of the European Action in Syria, which will be framed and adapted to the existing situation, but without forgetting, once again, the big perspective, which is a political process that will bring a solution to the Syrian conflict. We continue to emphasize the need for early recovery activities in Syria on the whole territory, in the whole of Syria, which means everywhere. But of course, in due diligence, compliance, and tracking of the implementation, and trying to avoid any spoiling, corruption, which is sadly the existing rule in the regime area. We will work closely with the UNHCR and support its effort in the framework of its dialogue with the regime to create the conditions that will enable a safe return for the refugees. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Special Envoy, for highlighting how the Syrian government is still a source of instability for the region, touching on why returns to Syria from Lebanon are not voluntary, why returns more broadly are not safe and dignified, and explaining more about France's position on the EU's push to reassess its strategy on Syria. We really appreciate you for taking the time to join us today and imparting these comments and France's position on refugee returns. The Special Envoy will have to leave before the end of the panel, but I want to remind everyone that you can leave questions in the chat for the rest of our panelists as they come up. We will be discussing more of the EU push to reassess policy regarding Syria towards the end of the panel, but for now, we will transition to our next speaker, Leila. Leila is a Syrian lawyer and human rights activist who has documented human rights violations in Syria and violations against Syrian refugees in neighboring countries. Leila will keep her video off for safety reasons, but when we have these policy conversations, it is often too easy to lose sight of the most important piece of the conversation, the individuals who are impacted. Leila will therefore offer an on-the-ground perspective as to how the ongoing policy conversations regarding Syria being safe are detrimentally impacting Syrian communities in neighboring countries, which will guide and influence the rest of our conversations today, and we hope in the future. Leila, the floor is yours.
تحياتي للجميع. شكرا لك تينا.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Tina. And I would like to thank SJAC for allowing me to speak on this topic. I am Leila. I am a Syrian lawyer and a human rights activist. I document violations against Syrian refugees in general, especially in the neighboring states. I will speak based on my work. I conducted many interviews with a number of persons who have been deported forcibly from Turkey. I will talk about the difficulties I faced during my work. The biggest difficulty was the fear to talk about this topic, namely for those who have been deported and they came to the Syrian government held areas and they were forcibly disappeared and tortured. The youth people have arbitrary detention and they die under torture, or they have military service, let alone the extortion they face if they make it to the regime-held areas. I will be talking about some of the interviews I received, and I had this dialogue with one mother of a deported person. She gave details. She feared for her husband live, who was still living in the Syria government areas, but she stressed that her son was killed under torture in the Syria detention facilities. He was killed after he was deported from Turkey. He had to go back to Syria, where he was detained on one checkpoint. After some time, his body was given back to the family, and he died under torture. Although this was in the news in the media that her son was killed under torture, but the family did not want to give details because they feared from the suppression and the oppression of the Syrian government and their security apparatuses, as she said. She told me that she had to appear on the media channels affiliated to the Syrian regime to deny what the media said about the fact that her son was killed under torture. She was talking to me and she was scared. She was in panic. She said she lost her son and she doesn't want to lose her husband. Today, with the high deportation level, especially in Turkey, and after Kayseri state, all the incidents we witnessed there, the number of Syrians who have been deported from Turkey to north of Syria in the first 6 months of 2024 increased up to or more than 100,000 Syrians in the last 6 months, or the first 6 months of 2024. The biggest percentage of those who have been deported are the youth, and the biggest suffering for them from the interviews was their families stayed in Turkey, and this scattered the families and disbanded the families. They don't have the heads of their households. 1.2 million people live in the camps, and many of these areas are subject to uh, random bombing, this indiscriminate bombing by the Syrian regime, in addition to having some militias, extreme militias in the region. A point I would like to highlight, we noticed from the interviews with those deported from Turkey, there is a new phenomenon which is trying to come back to Turkey in an illegal manner. After they are deported, to come back on a voluntary basis, those who are deported, they try to come back to Turkey to smuggle themselves into Turkey, and this puts them, in danger. And also they are subject to being abused by the border guard. One person died under torture. He was tortured by the border guard after he tried to come back to Turkey, and he was taken to Idlib hospital, but he died in the hospital because of the torture he received by the border guard in Turkey. We're talking about people who are trying to go back to Turkey.
هنا تبدأ معهم معاناة
If
من نوع
they can make it safe, there is another suffering, and this suffering is related to not holding any legal document. They don't carry any legal document. It's difficult to move around. It's difficult to access health, social, or education services. In addition to it, their inability to find a job. Today, in the interviews, I noticed that the individuals who managed to access Turkey live today in agricultural areas or in remote areas because they are not free to move around. They are afraid to be arrested again by the migration patrols all over Turkey. And this happened to a young person in June this year. He was deported for the second time from Turkey. He was deported for the second time without being able to hire a lawyer to defend him. He left his family and kids in Gaziantep, and he couldn't find a job in North East Syria. He was sent to North Syria, and after he was fed up there with the pressure of his dad, who lived under the regime-held areas, he had to go back or to have a settlement because he was asked for the reserve service. And based on the settlement, he thought that he was in a safe situation. He went to the regime-held areas. He was stopped by the first checkpoint by the military police in Aleppo. And he was killed under torture after 20 days of being arrested, and his body was given to his parents. If Now I'm talking about deportation to the regime-held areas. Let me talk about deportation to the, the National Syrian Army, or HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Deportees find other violations. I had an interview with a witness from Kahraman Marash in Turkey to the factions controlled areas. She was a university student. She was deported in August 24. Today, she's being displaced internally because of the heavy bombardment Idlib received by the Syrian airstrikes and the Russian airstrikes. She wanted to temporarily live with her relatives because she didn't have a shelter. Usually, there is no shelter after deportation for those who are deported from Turkey. She had to live temporarily with her relatives, and then she started to be displaced from one village to another, looking for safety, let alone the financial difficulties and losing her right to education, although she spent 12 years in Turkey. Today, we can generally say that the forced deportation from Turkey and from all neighboring countries is an obsession, is a concern. We noticed that this prompted many of them to think to travel to EU countries, and this is done illegally via Greece because they are afraid from deportation and they don't want to go back to the Syria regime-held areas. In the interviews, we noticed that recently this increased with the intensive deportation campaigns, and this involves their death by drowning or lost in the woods, in addition to the harassment by the Greek border guard, let alone the financial extortion and psychological extortion they can face by the human traffickers. I just try to give some examples, realistic examples about the many interviews we held with many of the witnesses, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Leila, for sharing more with us about how Syrian communities are being detrimentally impacted by these policy conversations around Syria being safe and more about the trends that you are witnessing. We hope these stories will center the rest of our conversation and advocacy efforts in the future. Our next speaker, Mohammed El Abdallah, will be able to provide a more general overview of the ongoing rights violations within Syria that make Syria not safe. Mohammed is the founding director of the Syria Justice and Accountability Center, where he supports developing and leading the organization's strategic vision and works with project leads to support project implementation. Mohammed is directly involved in SJAC's transitional justice projects and the missing persons portfolio. He also represents SJAC in media and provides managerial oversight for the organization. Mohammed?
Thank you very much, Tina, and thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank Special Envoy Guillaume and Leila for their excellent remarks and for actually framing the conversation and for us. First, I want to take a second to thank France as a government, other than the Special Envoy, for his remarks, for accepting Syrian human rights defenders, journalists, and activists at risk. France is the only country in the world is issuing protection visa for activists at risk, human rights defenders at risk, and journalists at risk. And we want to call on other governments as well to do so. It's unfortunate that other European countries do not see the need to provide protections for human rights defenders. I want to go to the safe zone subject straightforward. It's alarming that Cyprus and Czech Republic were preparing to lead a mission to go to Syria to verify whether there are safe zones inside Syria. The battlefield, the lines of the fight can calm down in the last 3 to 4 years. That's absolutely true. The level of indiscriminate violence that's in the shape of airstrikes and artillery, shelling and missiles have been reduced absolutely between all the fighters and the parties, and that's due to a lot of reasons. The global truce was issued during COVID, the negotiation between Turkey and Russia for the northern borders and between the Syrian government and the SDF at certain points, the protections the US forces are offering for northeast Syria, etc. But that reduction of the level of violence does not mean the war has ended in Syria. Just in the last 2 weeks, Russia launched a series of airstrikes and a lot of villages and towns in Idlib for 3 days, conducting more than 20 to 30 airstrikes, killing civilians, including women and children. In the same time, Turkey last week bombed northeast Syria. More than 40 points were targeted, more civilian areas and civilian facilities, including, basically, we know the power plants and water facilitations all being targeted. So these are signs that there are no safe zones in Syria, and the reduction of violence happening in the country does not actually mean the war has ended. And we second the vision of France that unless we have irreversible political solution that provide guarantees and access and information, and we'll go back to the guarantees and to the access in a minute, we cannot think of Syria as a safe country for return. Some of the violations we've seen, as Leila put those stories forward, detention and disappearance and torture continue to be #1 fear for those who are returning from abroad, from Lebanon, from Turkey, from Jordan, or voluntary returning. If anyone is returning, I don't think anybody is returning. People are being pushed, forced to return under voluntary return pretext. So the disappearance cases, and whether you were pushed to the opposition areas or you were pushed to the Syrian government areas, we've seen stories and documented incidents where people were returned to the northern area where opposition is controlled, but they had to cross back to the government-controlled area because that's where their families are, and they were detained and disappeared, and then later the families were handed a death notice saying they died in custody. Other violations we've seen in general, and also Ambassador Guillaume, you touched on this, is the HLP, housing, lands, and properties. We have erased cities and erased towns and erased villages. Those were heavily bombarded by the Syrian and Russian air forces, and there's no elements of life in these cities and towns. So what's the point of returning somebody to Douma, where there's no living elements, there's no homes, no schools, no hospitals, no jobs, no economic opportunities, nothing in the country. And that goes to a lot of other areas. We have Damascus suburb is almost leveled, Homs is almost leveled, the city at least. Idlib has a severe destruction, Aleppo has severe destruction, Raqqa is still leveled, majority of it, the city at least, after the US campaign against ISIS, and also a lot of their resort villages and towns are in the same situation. The third element I want to touch on is the economic opportunities and the living opportunities for those who are returning, because there is, and I apologize for the word, there's a stupid proposal, very stupid proposal being put forward by some immigration authorities in Europe that, yes, you're from Homs, but we'll ship you to Tartus because it's safe. You're from Deir ez-Zor, but we'll send you to Latakia because it's safe. These are horrible proposals. They're bad for a lot of reasons. They're not going to work for a lot of reasons. People do not know these cities. They do not belong to these cities. These proposals ignore the fact that a lot of the fighting in Syria actually touched on sectarian lines. People were picking up arms to fight across sectarian lines in Syria and sending people to these communities. It's coming more or less showing what happened between the Bosnians and the Serbs. Okay, let's send you, you're a Muslim Bosnian, let's send you to Serbia to live there. It's safe, there's no fighting there. Good luck to you. This is exactly what the European immigration authorities are trying to put forward in terms of proposals. I want to move to the military service because it's the second point of fear for a lot of Syrians. The conscription by the Syrian government. Yes, Bashar al-Assad is playing the game really well. He's issuing an amnesty for military deserters or military evaders. Every year there's an amnesty saying you will not be imprisoned, you will not be punished, but you will be conscripted, immediately drafted to the service. We don't have independent judiciary in Syria can look over the implementation of those amnesties. Are they happening or not happening? We don't know. Second, people are subject to extortion, financial extortion. As the ambassador put it forward, the special envoy Guillaume, financial extortion, sometimes you have to pay an exemption fee up to $10,000 just to be exempt from servicing in the military. And that does not apply to everybody. You have to meet certain conditions and it's not being respected necessarily. Also, and this is a very important point because there's a big debate within EU courts. Different EU courts looked at these cases differently. If deserting the military or evading the military service in Syria is a good ground to apply for asylum in Europe or no, those people are evading the military more on conscientious ground, on beliefs. They don't want to be part of hostilities. And even if they are safe in court because the amnesties were issued and they're not going to face imprisonment, they're going to be put on a service, in a draft, in a force to go kill people, commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. So kind of more or less European governments, okay, you're not going to be imprisoned, go do what you want. And I find it embezzling, honestly, because I see how the judiciary in Europe is working really diligently to arrest those who committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria and made it to Europe, charging them and prosecute them and put them on trials for war crimes and crimes against humanity, but at the same time trying to facilitate the return of people or the forced return of people to go to the military so they can contribute or be part of such crimes. The last point I want to talk here, I want to touch on two things here. Special Envoy Guillaume, you touched on the case about the whole country needs to be safe, not a slice of it. And this is an excellent case from the European Court of Justice that related to a citizen from Moldova applied for asylum in Czech Republic, and he was denied because that area of Moldova is safe. But then the European Court for Human Rights said, or European Court for Justice said, the entire country needs to be safe. We've seen a lot of cases. We've seen the European Court of Human Rights striking down what Cyprus did of forcibly deporting two cousins from Cyprus to Lebanon. They're from Syria originally, and they told them you have to go to Lebanon. It was safe for you. That happened in 2021, and the court found just last month that was illegal, and Cyprus needs to pay 22,000 euros for every person as a compensation. What we're seeing here, and this is very problematic for Europe, that the EU governments and policies is opposing the EU courts' law and jurisprudence. And this is very problematic. EU is dragging the countries and the governments and even the national authorities, not only the EU as a whole, is going in one direction, opposing what their courts and justice system is saying. The courts are saying deportation is illegal, protection, secondary protection should be granted to Syrians, return is not safe, and you cannot claim there's a safe zone because there's a slice of the country is safe. But the governments are proceeding with it. So immigration authorities are more or less ignoring all the legal precedents being put together by both European Court of Human Rights and European Court of Justice. And this is very alarming. It's up to European governments where they want to go. They want to go to the cocktail party of Moscow. They want to look like Putin, or they want to uphold the rule of law. And this is even in principle is problematic, because all these treaties and agreements and protections were put forward for refugees. They've never been tested since World War II. And now they're under the test. And unfortunately, some governments are collapsing and failing in this test. Take Denmark as an example, the first country to ratify the convention, UN conventions on refugees, and the first country to start illegally deporting or depriving Syrians from renewing their residencies. They deprived two families from renewing their residencies in 2021 because they were from a safe city, from Damascus. And then the European Court for Human Rights said that was illegal, and the Immigration Board of Denmark needs to reissue their residency permits. I want to go finally to the two quick points. Lack of information coming from Syria does not mean that these violations are not happening. It means Bashar al-Assad turned Syria to a black box. No monitoring happening, no journalists, no independent monitors, no human rights organizations are allowed. UNHCR are unable to meet with people independently. ICRC is unable to do work independently. Nobody can verify what's happening. So the very little cases leaking to outside, unfortunately, only when there are death under torture or major cases, not the small extortion cases, detention, abuses, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. These does not mean, the lack of information does not mean the violations are not happening. The violations are happening. We're doing our best to verify it. And please reach out to us. We're documenting to the best of our ability. Last but not least is the guarantees. I worry about the guarantees if we have a political process where the guarantees, we will have guarantees from the Syrian government about the detention or about the arrest or about torture. These guarantees like has a bad taste in my mouth, because I worked, when I was in Human Rights Watch in 2007, we worked in Guantanamo and the CIA detention facilities, how the CIA was sending people to be tortured in Syria, in Jordan, in Morocco, in Algeria, and elsewhere. But they received diplomatic guarantees from these states they will treat them well. Of course, the CIA sent them to be tortured in these countries and come back, and the diplomatic guarantees were nothing. So diplomatic guarantees without active monitoring, without open access to the country, without human rights organizations going in and watching what's happening is useless. It's similar to the guarantees Bush administration used when they had the detention and torture program back after 9/11. I'll stop here. I want to comment quickly on a few things, but hopefully in the question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for your remarks on the ongoing rights violations in Syria and for highlighting the real fears and threats Syrian communities face upon being returned to Syria. In addition to touching upon some of the conversations happening in the EU, we will now turn to Hiba Zayadin from Human Rights Watch, who will speak more to the topic of the rights violations refugees in particular face upon return to Syria. Hiba is a senior researcher in the Middle East and North Africa Division, investigating human rights abuses in Syria and Jordan. Hiba, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel. I'm going to try to not duplicate some of the things that we've heard from our other panelists, but maybe to stress some of these issues. So first off, I mean, Human Rights Watch has been documenting the situation in Syria for many years now. We've got several reports over the last couple of years on conditions for returnees, deportees to Syria, the risks associated with that. We, in fact, have a research product that came out just today on these arrests that we've been hearing about, that documents some of the arrests that happened of Syrians who are fleeing the violence in Lebanon. And as others before me have said, these are not people who are returning sustainably or permanently in any sort of way, and definitely not in a voluntary manner. They are fleeing what is an incredibly difficult situation, what always has been in Lebanon, but what has become increasingly violent, and where there are reports of Syrians not being allowed into collective shelters, being evicted from their homes to house displaced Lebanese. So really, they have absolutely no other choice but to flee back across the border and to be internally displaced for the most part. So we put out this piece just today on some of the arrests, but also on cases that we've documented since the beginning of 2024 of enforced disappearances, of deaths in detention, to show that this really does continue, that this persists, that has not changed. And in fact, the special envoy had mentioned that part of the impetus for some countries wanting to reevaluate the EU strategy is that the situation must have definitely changed on the ground. It has, but only for the worse. Especially in terms of the lawlessness that pervades every part of Syria. And we've got, a report as well from this year on Turkish occupied territories that just shows how incredibly dangerous those areas are. And a lot of the same abusive practices that we see employed by the Syrian government, we see being adopted by some of the other non-state actors who are in control of other regions of Syria. So in terms of people fleeing, I was in meetings just today in Brussels actually on some of these issues, and I'm hearing some of the arguments that are coming back. One is around the a proportionality argument, let's say, not from an IHL perspective, but basically saying, oh, if it's just dozens of people that are being arrested, we're talking about 400,000 coming back. One, it's important to stress that these are not just people that are being arrested, they're being enforceably disappeared. Their families do not know why they were arrested. They're not being picked up just at the border crossings with Lebanon, but also deep into Syria as they make their way through at checkpoints along the way. Families have no idea why they're being arrested, where they're being taken, and have no way of communicating and figuring that out. There is not enough information. I'm on several Facebook groups of Syrians in Lebanon who are continuously discussing, conditions upon return. What do they need to think about? What do they need to worry about? What kind of guarantees, and we can get back to the guarantees issue, do they need to make a safe passage towards wherever their destination, their temporary destination is. And there is a lot of misinformation. UNHCR is not able to give clear information and up to date and accurate information to people going back because of this access issue. And back to that proportionality argument, oh, it's just a dozen people, so what? I mean, first, it's not so what, because we know that it could lead to death in detention, because we know it leads to forcible disappearance, because we know that that's a national trauma that Syrians have to deal with on a daily basis in terms of people they've lost, that they don't know where they are, whether they're dead or alive. But then also a point that Mohammed had already mentioned, which is, in this context, no news is not good news. It basically very clearly means that there's a lack of access. Organizations like ours, the UN itself, nobody has access to areas where people are returning, to areas or where they're fleeing or settling for the time being. It is incredibly difficult, year on year, becoming even more difficult to do this kind of research in any sort of quantitative way because of this lack of access and because people are incredibly afraid to speak to us. So a lot of the times, a lot of the research that we do, and I can touch a bit on methodology here, is with relatives who live outside of Syria, who feel like they're more comfortable at speaking, and obviously almost exclusively in an anonymous manner. And even when people are willing to use their names, I would choose not to because of the fear of retaliation that their family members that remain in the country can face. So it's important to keep that in mind in terms of this is only the tip of the iceberg. We don't really know how many arrests have happened. We can look at the absence of information. We can look at what information we have. For example, for the most part, it's women and children that are crossing back into Syria. Now, a lot of men are possibly crossing back as well, and the numbers are probably higher because people are going in not through the official borders. And men are doing that because they are trying to, the best of their ability, avoid having any sort of run-ins with security branches. Now, again, back to this issue of guarantees, and I think that really is not a conversation that should be had at all at this point. I think we've debunked the idea that we can get any sort of guarantees from the Syrian government. And then if we look at it on an individual basis, almost every Syrian that thinks about going back, and we're talking here pre this recent displacement, which is quite chaotic and people are just having to go on the run. But before that, people would try to get some sort of guarantees before going back. So either through relatives or through brokers, they would try to figure out whether they're on some wanted list, this security branch or that security branch, and whether they're on those lists. We've documented a few cases, and many other organizations have documented others as well, where people do get those guarantees, and they do, their family members or those brokers come back and they tell them, you're not on any wanted list, you're good to go, you can travel back. And even after that, they get picked up and they don't know why. For example, in this most recent report that we put out, we have a case of a recent deportee, in 2024, a Syrian deportee from Turkey who was sent back to Azaz, obviously separated from his family as well, from his wife and children. After a while in a place where he has no meaningful ties and is not able to guarantee himself any sort of livelihood, he decided to risk it and to return to the areas that he is from, which are in Syrian government controlled areas. Obviously, before doing that, goes through the entire process of what we call in Arabic tafish amni, which is these security screenings or security guarantees by having his family check with branches. They tell him he's okay, comes back, gets picked up at a checkpoint. 24 days later, he's dead, and we don't know why or how. So this idea of guarantees, I mean, people are trying to do it on an individual basis is failing. We just cannot have any sort of guarantee when it comes to that. In terms of the concept of safety and how people perceive that. So the more meetings I have in Europe, the more I'm understanding that when people talk about a safe country, they're talking about hostilities, and I think Mohammed, you've alluded to this as well. And yes, active hostilities have to a certain extent been reduced, but that's not the only element we think about when we think about safety, right? It's also about the security sector, which has not been reformed at all, and which is only getting worse in terms of being able to figure out who's doing what and who's responsible for which arrest. But also in terms of general insecurity, and this is another thing about safe areas, which we Human Rights Watch has done a lot of work in many different contexts on this concept, which is not really very well defined and means different things to different people. You've got Turkey saying that the northern strip that they most recently occupied between Ras Al Ain and Tel Abyad is what they intend to become a safe zone, or what already is, and they're already sending more and more, deporting more and more people to that area. You've got in Europe people deeming Tartus and Latakia as safe for other reasons. This concept of safe zones presumes that anyone who's outside of the safe zone is not afforded the rights that they should be afforded. And that's the thing. The safe zone does not afford you more rights. You are protected or should be protected wherever you are. And this idea of safe zones is just quite convoluted. Another thing when it comes to that is while one place might be relatively safe for one particular person, whatever his profile is, in Syria today, the path towards that, the journey towards that relatively possibly safe place is anything but safe. And that goes back to this idea of general insecurity. It's tied to the economic deterioration that is only getting worse with the war on Lebanon. You know, kidnapping for ransom is on the rise. There are a lot of reported cases more recently. People who are on the move are generally more vulnerable. We're talking about people today in terms of this most recent displacement who may have not returned or been to Syria in decades, not decades, but in up to a decade. So they don't know how to navigate, you know, the checkpoints, some of which are informal, that are popping up even more recently, and so are more vulnerable to that. There's also this perception, maybe at times, that people from outside of Syria are on the wealthier side, for example, or have family members in Europe or in wherever that could pay that ransom, and so they become even more vulnerable to that kind of thing. So this idea of movement within the country from one place to the next, and especially for people who have not been living in the country for a long time and who do not have that kind of community, local base that could help figure out which armed group picked somebody up, makes it all the more dangerous. I can let people ask more questions in the question answer period, but let me see if there's one thing that I had forgotten to mention. Yeah, I think I can end here, and we'll open it up to questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiba, for informing us about some of the rights violations that refugees face upon return to Syria, and we hope that everyone will read the report that Human Rights Watch released today that Hiba mentioned. Our next panelist, Robert Nestler, will now be shifting the conversation back to the EU, speaking more about how the idea that Syria is safe is impacting EU policy. Robert Nestler is the director at Equal Rights Beyond Borders, a Greek-German organization that provides free legal aid to asylum seekers across the EU. He specializes in EU migration and asylum law and international human rights protection. Robert?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you also a lot for to the speakers that spoke before me already. I have to make an announcement before the German train service let me down, so I'm not in my office, but I'm sitting in a place that might be a bit noisy. I hope you understand me well. Otherwise, Tina, feel free to interrupt me. The task I got was not that easy, I would say. I'm going to talk about how EU policy is impacted by the notion that Syria is safe, but rather I would put it maybe how the EU is excluding Syrians from protection, because there are different ways to do this. And I made a small and I brought a presentation because I want to cover a few points. I won't talk too much, but I want to somehow structure this into before entry or before the respective state gains jurisdiction, at entry, after entry, and after recognition, because this is all parts of the protection procedure, of the asylum procedure, where somehow people can be excluded from protection. And I also want to make some general remarks before. So, I mean, you all know, as I see already from the speakers list, many things about Syria, about European asylum procedures already. I don't have to tell you that Syrians with Afghans are the biggest group of protection seekers. We are keeping out the Ukrainians here, and the general discussion about people on the move becomes more hostile in the whole EU. I think this is also important to underline. Most of you know this, but I also want to make the point that the discussion about returning people to countries of persecution often is held and have without actually considering whether it is safe or not. It is just an announcement made saying, okay, we want to return Afghans, we want to return Syrians. There's not the discussion very often going on whether this is safe or not. This is just, we should, even though it might not be safe. I think this we also have to take into consideration when we see how European asylum policy is developing in this direction, especially when it comes to criminals, what is very much the narrative that we see lately in Germany and beyond. Then it is not about whether the country where the person is deported to is safe or not. It is just that the person should not be here very much. And in the discussion, we also had this already, the safe area discussion is the most important that we see very clearly. And there also, Mohammed already addressed this judgment. I also want to make a point on this a bit later on. And also we saw that member states urged the Commission to give it a closer look in the EU to look into whether they can handle Syrian asylum applications more effectively, meaning also to somehow find ways to actually deport people back to Syria. Before entry, I just want to make the point that we also see the development of the common European asylum system that doesn't only concern Syrian, but also Syrians, obviously, where we have had the agreement on the common European asylum system in May 2024. Sorry, now it's loud for me. I hope you understand me. In 2024. And all the rules that are in there are getting into force in 2026. So we are in between situation. This is also important to see because especially regarding the notion of the safe country of origin, a lot will also change with the new pact once it is in force, and we have to monitor this very closely also in terms of the safe areas and so on. But what is clearly the aim of the common European asylum systems reform is to deter protection seekers, Syrians and non-Syrians, but all of them. And the harsh border regime also makes crossing much more complicated. The number of shipwrecks we see increasing a lot in Greece at the moment. I think this is also important to see. It doesn't have anything to do with the notion that Syria is safe, but it has something to do with the broader narrative of somehow deterring people to come and deporting people back. And of course, this is also before entry that we see certain deals with third countries, meaning not the country of persecution and not the country of protection, to somehow provide funding to prevent people from fleeing already. And this is Lebanon very recently, as you know, following the Cyprus situation. This is Tunisia and this is other deals. So people and Syrians don't even reach European shores, so that before entry already there's this narrative created and already there is a way found to exclude Syrians from protection in the EU. Once people have arrived, another regime applies because they filed a request for protection. They somehow articulated a wish for asylum, so the member states have to do something with the requests. And there I want to just shed light on the situation that before checking whether Syria is even safe, there's also an admissibility procedure, which is designated especially for Syrians. Member states have the possibility to label third countries such as Turkey, we have heard about this, or other countries as safe. The most important or most known deal on this is the EU-Turkey deal, in particular tailored to Syrians. As you can imagine, can you remember, I guess it didn't work at all, but it is an idea to somehow bring people back to Turkey, to somehow bring Syrians back to Turkey so that the responsibilities are not undertaken. Italy-Albania deal is another case. It is a very special case. It is a bit more sophisticated, legally speaking. The UK-Rwanda deal, okay, not somehow concerning Syrians that much, but also here you see we try to externalize protection. We try to get rid of people in the sense that the admissibility of the asylum application is already put into question. And important to see that the threshold is lowered a lot in the new common European asylum system for this, but still an individual assessment is needed. And why this is somehow influencing the notion that Syria is safe, because obviously there's a big risk of chain refoulement to Syria, from Turkey, from Lebanon. We have heard this already, how many people are actually brought back from there. Pushbacks, I just want to make a point on this. They massively take place. They also concern Syrians. I think it is important to see that this is already preventing Syrians from entering, and there we have the same issue with the risk of the chain refoulement. Now we come to the eligibility, what we have discussed already. The eligibility of the asylum application is the question whether the country of origin is safe for the person or not. And here we come or whether the person has grounds for protection, let's say. And here we come to the discussion of the panel. It is still the case that most EU member states recognize Syrians as beneficiaries of international protection, but it is also important to see that there are different reasons for recognition and different status. For example, Greece, the majority that passed the admissibility, so that are not deemed to be deported to Turkey, get a refugee status. A refugee status is a status following the Geneva Convention, meaning that there is an individual persecution. And in Germany, for example, the majority of the protection seekers receive subsidiary protection, meaning there is a risk of serious harm. This is both status taken together are the European international protection status. And there is a CJU judgment that you also know, because Germany mainly always flagged that because people are avoiding military service, they only get subsidiary protection. It says that avoiding military service can also be considered in some cases as direct persecution, or on the other way around, it doesn't mean that people who avoid military service cannot qualify for refugee status at all. But now we see that the general recognition of Syrians somehow being entitled to international protection is eroding. I mean, we have seen the judgment that has many times been taken into account of the Higher Administrative Court of Münster that found a Syrian not to be eligible for subsidiary protection because there is no serious general danger to life and limb of the civil population in Syria due to civil war. This judgment therefore refers to one out of the 3 reasons for serious harm that would qualify for subsidiary protection. And the court, I think this is important to somehow flag, goes very far beyond of what it was concerned. And the reasoning is very poor. It does not take opinions of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs into account, not of the EUAA, the European Agency for Asylum and Migration. Okay, I keep forgetting the new names of the agencies, but the UAA is the successor of EASO, not of NGOs, but rather the opinion of a Danish government that has been also based on an NGO that has not been named. And the court takes a body count approach, meaning the number of the people that have been killed in this region somehow don't add up to a persecution, and that is why it would be okay. The CGU said before that this is obviously not enough, but other issues have to be taken into account as well. And it is important to say that this is not the highest court in Germany deciding on the facts, but there would be the Federal Administrative Court, where technically a remedy could be filed, but not in this case, because actually in this case the applicant was excluded from subsidiary protection in the end. However, what is also important to see, the majority of the Syrians in Germany have been granted subsidiary protection not for this civil war reason, but for other grounds, namely the risk of torture or inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment of an applicant in the country of origin. But the court also says, okay, this risk we don't see at the moment. But that Syrians get granted this status shows that the German asylum service has basically ended the civil war in Syria long before, because they granted after 2015, first, of course, on the civil war reasons, the subsidiary protection, later on the risk of inhumane treatment, torture, or punishment. But what is also important to say is, even if the person doesn't get subsidiary protection, they still cannot be deported to Syria from Germany. They still get a humanitarian status because of a possible human rights violation. And what is also important to say is that all other high courts in Germany still find grounds for subsidiary protection. And also, for example, the highest administrative court in Austria very recently found that there is grounds for serious harm in Germany. And I said the European Agency for Asylum in Syria, sorry, of course. And also the European Agency for Asylum sees it differently, like also still most of the asylum services. I think we are saying that this is eroding, but we also have to underline at the moment, protection is in most cases still granted. And I'm coming to an end soon. We had the Denmark discussion already. We had the discussion about the Court of Justice judgment already on the safe areas. if a country is dedicated as a safe country of origin, it can only be dedicated as a whole country. And the German Ministry of Affairs, I want to leave this quote here, is also saying, according to the findings of the Federal Foreign Office, to date, the situation in all parts of Syria is characterized by great uncertainty. The human rights situation and humanitarian conditions are deficient. But still, and this is somehow, as we all already underlined, the reality is not in line at all with the political demands, because they are very loud in terms of possible deportations. And then we have the discussion on the withdrawal of the status for so-called criminals after the recognition. But I think, Tina, you turned on your video, so I think I'm over time already, meaning that I also covered most of the issues, because member states, including Germany, and especially Germany, are very loud in saying that criminals should be deported, but it is also important to see that this is not that easy, because the status that has been granted, no matter whether it is refugee status or subsidiary protection, somehow must cease or be revoked in any sense, and the threshold for this is very high. And even if the status is revoked, the persons still have the humanitarian status if they are deprived of international protection, so they are still safe from deportations. And I'm going to make a dot here, as we say. I didn't look at my time. I would have one other slide, but I think this is the basis for the discussion that we can continue. What I want to underline is that the notion that Syria is safe very much influences European asylum policy. There is a strong desire of political decision makers to find a way to deport Syrians back to Syria. But at the same time, there's also a general narrative trying to deport people, no matter whether the areas are safe or not. And I think that both discussions somehow have to be taken into account when discussing about the notion. Thank you very much again, and sorry that I somehow took a bit too much of the valuable time.
You did not take too much. Thank you, Robert, and to our esteemed panelists for your time and insightful contributions. I'm going to quickly transition into question and answer to give us the maximum amount of time for discussions. And panelists, where possible, I'd ask you to keep your responses succinct so that we can get to at least a few questions. Robert, I'm actually going to pick up on a conversation that you were discussing around how the political reality in Germany is not necessarily reflecting the factual reality in Syria. And we have a question from an audience member that touches on how some European countries are proposing solutions for the safe return of Syrian refugees, and that this suggests a lack of understanding of how things may be operating in Syria and the specific context of the country. Can you or any of the other panelists talk about how, if this is indeed the reality, on whom does this misunderstanding fall? And how can a better understanding of the situation in Syria be conveyed to policymakers and decision makers? So Robert, I don't know if you want to jump on that, or if
I can start. As I said, I think there's also many political decision makers, especially of different member states where the right wing now maybe dominant policy, are in denial of the situation also. I think this is important to see. So some people are out of reach for civil society, I would say. But what I think always is important is that the information that is brought into the discussion is reliable. So that is why the organizations like yours, but Human Rights Watch and so on, are so important to come with first-hand information. And it is also always to underline, because I see that this doesn't reach the discussion, that Syria is a black box and that actually getting information from there is nearly impossible. So I think the situation somehow is quite dominant in terms of political decision makers raising the issue, but less dominant in civil society in terms of somehow bringing in information. This doesn't mean it doesn't concern you, but civil society at the moment, is, at least in Europe, I would say, is still too concerned with 1 million different issues in asylum law matters, so that they can't hold track on the issues with Syria, while this is very important to somehow bring back to the arena.
Can I pick on this, Tina, quickly? Thank you very much, Robert. I cannot thank you enough for all the remarks and all the speakers. The issue here is that the Europeans they don't know, the European governments. It's actually, they know what's happening. It's just ignoring the facts from Syria because the political discourse in a different location. And take UK. UK is out of the EU, we understand that. But when the UK was designing the Rwanda deal to start deporting refugees back, the courts domestically in the UK said that's illegal. So the government trimmed the proposal again and put it forward. And then the European Court for Human Rights come and said, that's illegal, you cannot do it. And then the UK threatened to withdraw from the European Court for Human Rights. This is really bad. This is terrible. If you have principles and instruments and laws, and then when it doesn't work in your favor, then you withdraw from them. This is what Putin is doing. Exactly what Putin did when he invaded Ukraine. So it's up to the EU countries what they want to do. The second point is, and especially to Germany, Germany is leading in the universal jurisdiction cases to prosecute former fighters, officials, militia members, terrorists from Syria who made it to Germany. So then the German government takes a big credit for that. Rightly so, they should be thanked for that. But from one hand saying our judiciary is amazing, can follow our criminals who committed crimes in Syria and came to Germany. But when a Syrian commits crime in Germany, we're not capable in putting him in trial. So we're going to ship him back to Syria. This is horrible. You're saying you're a failed state. You're a terrible state. And this is really bad. And I want to pick on Ilham Ahmed and her bad proposal to Northeast Syria to send people. You get Northeast Syria, a place where no actual governance, inherently corrupted governance system, like the corruption in Northeast Syria is unheard of. There's that. The bombardment of Turkey and the Northeast Syria on a daily basis in some weeks. And then you get even the Arabs in the region who were originally from there, they cannot go back to their homes without somebody verifying they are not ISIS. But Ilham Ahmed wants to voluntarily take the criminals that Germany wants to deport, Syrian criminals. This is when two bad actors meet together, the right wing from Germany and a bad governor or one of the governing authorities from Syria. And this is definitely contributing to make the situation worse. The right wing and the government in Germany know exactly what's happening, and the burden is on them. We're going to continue document what's happening. We're going to continue go to court. And I want to flag two things here. We will be putting forward asylum briefs, documents, country expert reports, statements, and potentially an annual country of origin report that's drafted by us to make it available to be used in judicial proceedings against asylum agencies or immigration authorities. And also we will be able, hopefully, to pick up some cases and litigate those cases for strategic value, defending the right of subsidiary protection and right to seek asylum in these countries.
Thank you both for your answers. I hear that there is a need for civil society to continue its documentation efforts, but Hiba, something that you touched on and a question that we have is the lack of accurate information and the lack of information in general. And so I was wondering if you or any of our panelists could speak a little bit more to how the lack of information is being weaponized to further the notion that Syria is safe, and what are steps that civil society and governments can take to address this lack of information, or at least combat the way in which it's being weaponized.
Right, thanks, Tina. Yeah, so I mean, unfortunately, it is being weaponized, and I've, like I had mentioned earlier, have had that argued back to me in terms of what is this? This is not, you're talking about 5 or 6 arrests or a dozen arrests. When we're talking about over 400,000 fleeing back. I think, it is difficult when we get confronted with this because, as Muhammad said, people know that there had been no structural changes in Syria. It's clear. I mean, it's not, if there had been structural changes, we'd be aware, but there haven't been. And instead, it's only gotten more criminally dangerous as well. And the lack of access is apparent. I mean, the Commission of Inquiry itself has no access to Syria and very clearly say it in their reports. And even then, the reports are very good at documenting, the violations across Syria that have taken place in, the period that they're looking into, but they don't have access, and we don't have access. The only part of Syria that I've been to is the northeast, and even then, the work that I was doing is extremely limited and restricted and had to be very, very cautious. So, you know, it's not something that it's something that needs to be mentioned, you know, at every point. And the biggest, I mean, the foremost condition here, and UNHCR itself acknowledges this, is effective monitoring. And we know that that does not even exist. I mean, there are certain conversations in Europe around improving monitoring. There is no effective monitoring. There is no independent monitoring at any scale. So it's not a question of improving it. It's a question of establishing that. And obviously, you know, it remains with the Syrian government itself to allow for unhindered access. But there is leverage. There is leverage that UN agencies can employ, and there is leverage that donor countries and EU countries can employ to push for that.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask one more question because we have a couple of questions submitted around early recovery, and I'll direct this to Mohammed, but ask others to add where they have additional remarks. The question that we've received asks about the positive and negative consequences of the early recovery efforts that some EU governments are trying to work on in Syria.
Yes, this is indeed a very important topic because early recovery is needed. We need some basic rehabilitations of certain schools and hospitals and basic services, water, sanitation facilities, etc. And some European governments and some humanitarian agencies are funding such efforts. However, is being misinterpreted and mispresented as that, oh, the war is over, we're back to reconstruction, and we moved in on the violence and the hostilities phase is over, and now there is a peace in Syria. Look, we're building a hospital. There's a couple of things to unpack here. One, given how corrupt the Syrian government, they're allowing such efforts to happen under the Syrian government-controlled area because it goes under their pockets. And we've seen these reports came a lot. The Guardian published a lot about how the UN agencies were involved with corruption and how certain people in certain important positions of the UN offices in Damascus are actually relatives. The wife of the former deputy foreign minister and one of the daughters, the daughter of Hussam Louqa, the chief of the military intelligence, she works for the UN inside Syria. So the Syrian government allow this. They employ their inner circle, they corrupt, they benefit from it, and they play the political games. Like, hey, Syria is safe, the war is over. It was a bunch of terrorists, we took care of them. You can send the refugees back. This is exactly messaging of Syrian government. The bad part is where the Syrian civil society is falling, and that's on the Syrian civil society, and that's on the Syrian public to understand this dynamic, because certain NGOs are involved with the early recovery, and either humanitarian groups or rescuing groups, or sometimes just transitional justice groups promoting for early recovery. As that special envoy said, we consult the civil society, rightly so. The civil society needs to be consulted, but some certain NGOs are over-promoting early recovery as something feasible, doable, it's open access, it's going great, because it benefits certain NGOs only. And that dynamic of being a little bit greedy, unfortunately, and being selfish, like, okay, we'll get a project of early recovery here and there, but that's damaging the whole narrative of the Syrian victims and playing more into the narrative of the Syrian government's hands directly. We've seen some early recovery and economic opportunity conferences are started in Turkey, and digging a little bit behind some of these conferences, the Turkish government was involved in some of those. They want to say in the north of Syria, there's economic opportunities, they're building schools, there's small businesses, 5,000 small businesses opened in a place where kidnapping and extortion at a checkpoint happens on a daily basis. So trying to over-promote that the war is over through early recovery projects is definitely a negative thing. It's a bad thing. It's selfish, it's greedy. Certain NGOs, I don't want to name anybody, but certain NGOs are complacent in this game. And this is what the ambassador, Special Envoy, mentioned. There's a donor fatigue, and a lot of the civil society, and also the civil society became a war economy civil society. Like, okay, we build schools. Oh, we don't fund schools. We'll write your curriculums. We don't write curriculums. We'll teach students. So the civil society, a lot of the groups are changing their missions to follow the funding. And the funding now is a humanitarian and early recovery. So we see kind of a push to that direction without understanding the consequences and the danger of playing this game. Only because handful of groups are playing this game does not mean early recovery is not reconstruction. Early recovery does not mean Syria is safe. Should not be interpreted in this way.
Tina, may I add just a point to that, to Muhammad, on early recovery? I mean, this is one thing we've also been looking at. My predecessor in the role actually did a huge report on the weaponization of aid by the Syrian government. And maybe just an example to give here in terms of, and again, we would think that this will be applied to early recovery as well. In terms of, in government-held areas, UN humanitarian activities basically lack completely, third-party monitoring, which is in stark contrast to, the rigorous vetting process that we've seen applied to the UN aid that is to opposition-held northwest Syria from Turkey, and we saw, post-earthquake 2 years ago now, that vetting process in action. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when we think about early recovery. Obviously, it is needed. Obviously, infrastructure needs to be rehabilitated, but there needs to be conditions that donor states impose on how that is taken forward, and how it is being implemented to, to the best of their abilities, push back on this weaponization, which leads to discrimination and leads to, certain areas being developed while others that are considered, opposition or previously opposition to the government being ignored or neglected. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when we talk about early recovery as well.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for the panel, but I would like to extend another thank you to our esteemed panelists and to Special Envoy Guillaume for your contributions, and to everyone in the audience for taking the time to participate in this discussion. We hope that this space serves as a springboard for further collective action that combats the notion that Syria is safe for return. I do see that we have some more questions, and after the event, you will receive a follow-up email with links to our recordings of this event, both in English and in Arabic, and you can leave comments there with any additional questions that we were not able to answer today. Thank you for joining.